welcome to another session of Grognards of Gaming. All right, I'm Phil, but if I'm dressed as my Ars Magica wizard for Halloween, you see me around, call me Quenquist. I think we talked about characters, or we'll talk about characters in some future session, but I'll tell you all about him later. But guess who's joining me again for another blockbuster show? It's my good friend. Go ahead and introduce yourself, my friend.
Rob, the Grognard dog.
The Grognard dog. That's awesome. You could be a wrestler in the 80s.
I'm totally
you could
gonna
be
do that.
El Grognardo. You could be one of the Mexican wrestlers with a mask.
That is my Halloween costume. You just did it.
Now, for people who have actually heard previous sessions and they know how much we love the Fate session or the Fate system because we talked all about it like two of the last three sessions. Mexican wrestling might be a real good genre. So let's just keep that, in our
Yes.
in our notebook.
Yes, and remember, appreciation is not appropriation.
That's right. And imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and if there's anything I've ever wanted to do with my GMing and my playing, it's imitation and flattery all the way, and honoring. Yes.
And Mexican wrestling. I'll drink to that.
Absolutely. La lucha libre. So Rob, for this session, you and I thought of something that every game master needs. They need a bag, man, a bag of holding of tips, tricks, techniques that make their stories like pop, my friend. And I will tell you, I'll start out with a compliment. I have seen many a story pop from you. You say that I'm a good GM. Well, heck, I can only compare myself to the master sitting on the other side of the screen right here. I've had so many good sessions with you and so many great storylines that in future sessions, we've planned to actually talk about storylines, different characters. But we decided tonight, I think you and I had a good exchange about this. We're going to go with some GMing, what I call the GM hacks. Now, the last couple of sessions we've done kind of a top 5 kind of thing. I don't know if I have a top 5. I have a little bit of what I would call the laundry list. So would you like to start introducing one of your favorite GM hacks? And it could be a tip, it could be a technique. You can give us a little story behind it, whatever you want. But when I say GM hacks, what's in your bag of holding of tricks? What do you think of, my friend?
Yeah. Well, so the way I come to every game when I'm a game master is I call it the Star Killer method, and that's not a reference. Yeah, it's not a reference to the sequel trilogy. The Star Killer base from the sequel trilogy of Star Wars. It's actually a reference to George Lucas's one of his original or early treatments of Star Wars when it was still called The Star Wars from the Adventures of Luke Starkiller. And so this is the analogy that I have in my head. I write an outline that is 1 page long, no more, no less. Okay, like one side of 1 page. And by an outline, I mean, let's say we're going to do a 3 to 4 hour session. Okay, that's probably going to be 4 or 5 scenes, more or less. So I will write a single line defining the 4 or 5 scenes. Okay, and then underneath each line, I'll do bullet points. Like important things that I want to happen in that scene, information I want to give, that sort of thing. And that outline is the script for The Star Wars from the Adventures of Luke Starkiller. Now, as Prussian Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke the Elder, not to be confused with Helmut von Moltke the Younger. We don't want to get those guys confused.
Right.
But Prussian Field Marshal. Easily confused. So Prussian Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke the Elder is famous for saying that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and so I apply that principle to gaming, and I don't think I'm the first. I actually think that one of the developers from Wizards of the Coast had actually I can't think of his name, but he's the fellow that developed the Dark Sun D&D setting for Wizards of the Coast. He was very heavily involved with Star Wars Saga Edition. Anyway, he actually took that quote and said it's true in gaming too, and I have found that to be the case. So the key here, again, yet another Star Wars analogy is you must approach it with a lack of attachment. You write that outline, but you do not get attached to it. So what that outline is for me is, if when I get to the table, sometimes the players, maybe we're playing on a weeknight after everybody's had a full day, 8 hours of work, and everybody's tired, or perhaps the players have writer's block, or they're
Right.
struggling with things in their lives, and they're not feeling particularly creative at that particular time, or
Right.
they're just
Right.
having an off day. So they may just want to be entertained. They may just, that might be just their philosophy of gaming. Like, I'm here now, GM
Right.
entertainment. So
Right.
that
It's more of a
outline,
passive. Yes. Yes. I've seen that. Yes.
yes.
Yes. Yeah, good. Good.
So for me, that outline is the default of what will happen that night, unless the players proactively change it. And so invariably, the players do proactively change it. Maybe sometimes they passively change it. They just make a decision that I didn't expect, that it's sort of a passive decision that kind of derails the outline. Good. I don't think of the outline as being my story. I don't think of it as being derailed. I think of it as like, all right, good. They've given it the player injection. They've given the story the player injection. So what I wrote up on that one sheet of paper as the treatment for the Star Wars from the Adventures of Luke Starkiller then ends up at the end of the night being Star Wars: A New Hope.
Okay.
And that's it. I mean, that works for me pretty much every time. Now, one might argue, if one were contentious, well, aren't you railroading by creating an adventure, an outline? And
Right.
my answer
Right.
to that is no. It's not outline. It's not railroading, because I don't push the players to go in that direction. That, again, is the default. What will happen if
Right.
the players don't take the
Right.
reins? But invariably,
Right.
they take the reins.
Yeah. Yeah. That
Yeah.
tracks
So that's
100% with a couple of things. Yeah, that's awesome, because it not only tracks 100% with my experience of role playing with you in the groups, but it also tracks with a couple of things that I've reflected on in my own GMing as I just try to get better over the years or whatever, or like things about, like, I think to myself, what worked there, Phil, what didn't work. You just kind of naturally have a self assessment. And one thing that I'm sure that it's a common thing we've said to each other before, but I've said to other people is, if you present three options to players, they're going to pick the fourth. And so that you got to be okay with that, right? So your Starkiller method, it allows for that kind of flexibility to happen. And what I would do, and so as you were describing that, I wrote a little note to myself, which is build around a scene. So that was one of my things I hadn't written on today's list, but I thought to myself, no, you got a great point, because a good GM will build around a scene that they know they want to culminate to, but the best GMs will allow for multiple roads to get there, right? And if it doesn't exactly happen the way that your inspiration, gives to you, that's okay, because if everybody got there of their own free will and it worked in an organic or a dynamic way that the players did a thing, then everyone wins, right? But that would
yeah.
actually often, for my planning, I would usually think about building to a scene. And I just thought to myself, if I could just depict this one scene, I don't care what happens otherwise, everything's going to be great. So that was interesting, because I actually had not put that on my list today, but you gave me something that I was like, oh yeah, of course, yeah. So absolutely. I wonder though, if you can guess, just because you know my jamming style, you can guess what was probably the first thing I put in my list of tips, tricks, and techniques. I
Oh
wonder if you
my!
can
What was
think
the
about
first?
how I've GM, right? What the Phil way of GMing is. What's like one of the things I almost always do for every session,
Well,
if
I
I
I
can
mean,
do it?
yeah, you almost always like will create something artistic to include in the scene. So whether it's a map or, okay, good. Whew.
Yep, you
I
got it.
got it.
No, yeah, I put you on the spot there,
Whew.
but you got it. It's draw. One of my GM hacks is perfect. Yeah. You got it. Otherwise, we have to re-record the session. No. You got it exactly. It's draw a map, right? Because you know that I
Yeah,
love to draw a map, and
I know
so
you do.
so intricately intimate, like linked with that idea of presenting a scene. For me, my expression became draw a simple map, and in my case, it wasn't simple. Sometimes I would go off the rails on a thing, because I
Beautiful.
love player visual aids and making that assist the vision accessible. Make this vision accessible to your players as much as possible. My way of doing that was through maps, because I enjoy maps anyway. In fact, you can, I don't know, if people see the video of this, not just the audio, they'll see a couple maps in my background anyway. But at any rate, but the map for me was a way of expressing that I wanted a scene to happen. Now, as it turned out, a lot of those situations were combat, because it's always really good to have a map, and then you can like talk about the tactics and all that. And so a scene of conflict, sure, is easy, but no, I would end up drawing maps of all kinds of stuff, and then players would feel like they. I just felt like we all could talk about a common thing, and we're all seeing this together, and it just seemed to work the story well. So that was one of my first GMing hacks, is draw a map, but definitely build around a scene.
Yeah.
Absolutely build around the scene. All right, so that was one of mine. You go again. What's another? Or go ahead, ask me a question if you have one. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to riff off of something that you said. So,
Please.
so you and I, we have a mutual friend and gaming buddy, Jonathan, and Jonathan is a really great GM. I love Jonathan's style of GMing because Jonathan was a radio, television, and film major when he went to college. And he loves radio, television, and film, and he really understands all of the tropes of visual
Mm-hmm.
storytelling. And I still game with Jonathan, and whenever I do, he never fails to just warm my heart with like the smallest details that he works in. I'm like, yup,
Yes.
that totally needs to be here. But when he GMs, he really not relies, but he really integrates visual aids into
Mm-hmm.
his storytelling. He will draw a picture of an alien or of an airship or of a villain or something, or even just like a piece of technology, a gun or something like that, a
Mm-hmm.
gas gun, and he'll hold it up when we get to that part where that thing comes into play, and and I've heard that kind of GMing criticized as well. It's more like show and tell, like the GM is just interested in show and tell. But I think that's an unfair criticism, because what Jonathan is doing, and I think that this may help a lot of GMs who are artistically inclined, is Jonathan is inspiring himself. He has an idea in his head, and then he puts it on paper. Let's say it's an airship, and that drives him to work towards the scene, as you put it, where the airship makes its appearance. And
Yes.
so when you get
Yes.
to that scene, it's fulfilling for Jonathan. He holds up that picture. Here's the airship you see, and everybody like sort of marvels at his artistic ability,
Yeah.
and wow, that's really
Yeah.
cool. And he feels great, and that greatness buoys
Yep.
him, and his buoyed
Yep.
spirit buoys the players, and it's just
Yep.
infectious. So it's
I've
a
seen it
wonderful
happen.
thing
Yep.
visually. I've seen it happen, yeah, and so he's really integrating both of the things you talked about, both the visual aids and the working towards a scene. And I like
Mm-hmm.
the way you described that,
Mm-hmm.
working towards a scene. I never thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you don't do the 4 or 5 scene outline, you could just do
Right.
a critical scene and let the
That's
chips
right.
fall where they may. That's
And
wonderful. That's a
yep.
great idea, Phil. Thank you.
Yep.
So okay,
Yep.
so another little tip and thing that I do, and it's actually something I've done recently, and I learned it from the Fate rules, which you'll see behind me, the Fate core
Mm-hmm.
rule book, which is right there. It talks about it uses the terminology zooming in on certain drama, and that's not a
Mm.
concept I ever really thought about until I read that in
Mm.
the book, and then I kind of meditated on that. And ever since I was introduced to the concept of zooming in from the Fate book, I have used it to great effect. So let me see if I can do it some justice by explaining it. The time that it's the time, a really good illustration of zooming in is um, you I do the Star Killer method. I've got 4 or 5 scenes written down, and boy, the players just kind of ripped right through it. They got through it really fast, and we've still got like I'm looking at my watch and I'm like, well, I've only got 2 scenes left on my paper, but we've got a long a couple of hours ahead of us still, and we're gonna have way
Yeah.
more time than just these 2 scenes. So what I do is the scene that I'm in, I will zoom in on the action and really get into the nuts and bolts of a scene. So, for example,
Mm.
a scene where somebody might just be burglarizing a house, I won't just rely on a burglary roll or whatever skill your gaming system uses for that sort of thing. I will really zoom in on the burglary scene and just let's make multiple rolls out of this, getting the door open, getting in, inspecting
Yeah.
it for cameras, for viewers, and you can really slow it down and move real close to the action, and make lots of skill checks, around the action. If the opposite is true, if you're running short on time, you could zoom out and you could go, all right, you
Right.
want to burgle the room and say, all right, give me a burglary roll, and you could kind of summarily do it with a burglary roll, maybe
Right.
one or two other rolls, and get in and out. And that's a
Right.
wonderful method. And a place where, so that's like probably the number one place where it happens the most often, and it's the most helpful. But another instance most recently is, one of my players, I'm running a game with two players, and one of my players suddenly couldn't make it, and so I was faced with just one player, and the outline, the Star Killer outline I had written, with 3 or 4 scenes, was for both players, and I had things for both of them to do that was sort of tailored to both of their characters, and now I was faced with only having half of the players around the table, and half of what I had prepared to come into play, so I just zoomed in on the half
Mm.
that was tailored to this character, and I was able to make an entire session out of it, and we had a wonderful one-on-one session. It was really I think one of the best sessions of the campaign so far, where it was just
Cool.
just this one player and me, and we really zoomed in. And so zooming in, I hope I've explained
That's a
it in a
great
way that
idea.
kind of makes
Yeah.
sense, but
It's a great
that's a
concept. It
fantastic one.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it totally does because though that phrase zooming in, zooming out, I'm going to use it in common parlance too. I think I'd forgotten that I'd seen that in Facebook myself, and I do remember what you're talking about. I really like your detail on it because you can a skilled GM can pick times to zoom in and zoom out for different reasons. Um, I've done a few things where I've thought to myself, did I really need to make these travel rolls or whatever? Or I could have just zoomed out on something. Um, but then when I zoom in, when I think about zooming in, one of the things that I was thinking of while you were describing that is one technique you can use when you're zooming in. You're making individual like more. You're describing the details with additional rolls or additional skill checks. You could always ask the players to describe, give their interpretation of what happened. So if they get like an extraordinary result, you can say, "Why don't you tell me what your character did?" And then they're like, "Oh," and it gives a little bit of, it seeds some like scene control, a little more troop style. It seeds some control to them, and then maybe they'll come up with something you would never have come up with if you had relied on your own interpretation of a failure or a success. But then something will come up, and you're like, "Oh my god, I'm glad you said that." I'm thinking specifically of a couple of games I've played recently. But there was one time when I was playing with my friend Josh, and he got like this amazing roll for something, and I said, "Okay." I said, "Every roll result has a story. You tell me the story." And so, like, it was almost like we didn't waste the dice had spoken. I asked him, "Tell me what you think the dice says before I tell you." And so, like, when you were describing that, I thought, yeah, you know what? That's a really smart idea. When you zoom in and then let the player kind of play with it as well, you can get some really interesting story out of it. So that's a really great technique, Rob.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. I love that. Every dice roll has a story. Tell me the story, because
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of times when I will do that. I'll turn it over to the player to let them narrate, and that sometimes when you turn the table like that, even though you're giving the player a great deal of power, they're taken off guard by that. They're not used to that, and you get this kind of doe in the headlights look, like, wait, what? What do you want me to do? And so what I will often say is, I'll pause a beat, and I'll go, I'm going to take off my GM's crown, and I'm going to put it on your head. Now you're the GM for this narration. Go ahead, you tell.
Yeah,
And
yeah, that's cool.
that sort of
That's
makes make
cool.
it, then
Yeah,
then it makes sense, and then they're like, oh, okay, I see. You're letting me do the narration. But I like
yeah.
your way. That's a nice way to do it too. It's like,
Hmm.
hey, every role has a story. Tell me the story. I love that. That's
Yeah.
beautiful.
It's
Beautiful.
almost like never waste a good roll or never waste a bad roll. Never waste a roll,
Yeah.
right? I mean, like, right? If you're gonna make them roll, there's a reason, right? The dice are spoken. So that actually, I'm looking at some of my notes for tonight, and I was thinking, there's one that also kind of riffs off of that I'll put in front of you because I know that your jamming style resonate and your playing style resonates heavily with this next thing. If we talk about how every role has a story, you can also talk about how everything, it's not just that things that go right, it's also things that go wrong. So one
Oh yeah.
technique is, you get players, and I think we both met them, where they just want their player to do everything correctly. They're sort of rules lawyer it. It's something we call min maxing. You're like trying to make the character like the beefiest possible or the fastest possible at the detriment of other things. But once you start saying, okay, well, you can have all those pluses, but what about your minuses? You can have all those
Yeah.
virtues, but what about your flaws? People go,
Yeah.
well, I don't want flaws in my character. I just want my character to be the best. And then when you wake them up and say, there's often more story in flaws than there are in virtues, then they go, what? But that's a very important GMing technique to have, is to let your player understand that there's story that can come out of everything. Don't waste a roll, and don't waste an opportunity to give your character even a handicap that would then bring out something very interesting about the character. And that in that way, it doesn't become about winning or doing awesome. It doesn't come about. It's not about who can roll the highest. It's about now how much story and enjoyment can we generate as a group, and you can use everything, right, good and bad, about your character. So I always kind of love
You
that about
can.
our games. I think we did a really good job of creating characters that were very multifaceted. Um, and some of the systems we had talked about in a previous session did that for us a little bit. That when I talk about virtues and flaws, I'm talking about Ars Magica. But even the fate system, I think too, it asks you to come up with something that dogs your character, that haunts your character, that
Yeah.
it's an obstacle,
Right.
it's maybe an enemy. You don't know, but you really have to think about that.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
definitely think that's a GM technique, that pulling story out of flaws and virtues is really important.
Yeah, the first gaming system I ever encountered that used what it called disadvantages was the champions system, and what the champions system did was, I think, as I recall correctly, because it's been a while since I used it, it tries to balance your powers, your advantages with your disadvantages. So and then you could take additional disadvantages, and for each point of disadvantage you took, it gave you additional points to use. So you can make your character more powerful, but there was always some downside, and I just thought that was brilliant.
Right.
I'm not a
That's
big fan
awesome.
of the champion system because it's so complicated, but I
Right.
did really love that about it. And and
Yeah.
and I was playing the champions system with the Queens group at the same time that I was playing Ars Magica with your group, and Ars Magica was using a similar thing with the disadvantages. So the flaws rather.
That's cool.
So
Yeah,
um,
flaws. Yeah.
so that was really reinforcing the value of that game mechanic. Now, that is a really hard thing for a lot of players to embrace when they come from the Dungeons and Dragons,
Yes.
heritage, if you will.
Right.
And so
Right.
I still game with players that have a hard time embracing giving their characters flaws, or have a hard time embracing the poor role. And I try so
Mm-hmm.
hard to reinforce to those
Mm-hmm.
players, like, don't
Mm-hmm.
bemoan the failed role, embrace it, because that means your character is going to get more spotlight, there's going to be more interesting things happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that. Yeah, that I think that there's a great deal of value in that, and that's a very good point. But it does require uh, a couple of things from the player. It requires the player trust the GM, that the GM is not out to screw you,
Mm-hmm.
and that the
That's
GM
right.
is looking to
That's
work
right.
with you to build a story. And
That's right.
that's not always. I can understand a player not trusting
Right.
in that concept, because there are a
Right.
lot of
If you come
GMs out
from that
there who
heritage,
who, who are
yeah.
contentious. But
Yeah, yeah. If you come from that
yeah,
heritage,
yeah,
the GM's
yeah,
controlling all of your. The only thing you see about the GM is that they're playing monsters that are trying to kill you. They're playing traps and obstacles that are trying to slow you down. They're giving you problems,
yeah.
and that's all you understand the GM to do. And I remember us talking about that with our Ars Magica group in New York, and I would say, guys, I'm actually on your side. I'm just trying to find ways to make it even better because you're going to defeat my stuff. Now, that being said, you
Yeah.
don't want to be what we call a Monty Hall GM either, which is just giving away
No.
everything for free and it attaches less
Right.
meaning. But I
Right.
think actually some of our more meaningful scenes, our meaningful successes, were based on long arcs of progress, but toil and strife, to a
Yeah.
built up point that we all, me especially, God, I was never more proud of you guys than you defeated my big bad, or you faced off the demon Ventress at one point. There was like a bad boy demon you guys faced off, or you finally cracked the code into Fairyland, or something like that. I was never more proud of you all until you guys went to the lengths required, and that was pretty interesting. So
yeah, if I may interject,
that
just
actually,
briefly.
yeah, please.
Yeah, so I think that that a good way to help build trust, if you're a GM and you fear that your players may have difficulty trusting you, is to express that pride verbally or however when the game is in session. So, for example, you may be playing an orc captain and his orc guards attacking the party, and you may be fighting tooth and nail, to really take down the characters. But when the characters really start to turn the table in that encounter, when they start achieving their first significant blows, it really helps, I find, to then like break character for a moment and go, yes, when the character rolls that 20, right. You cheer for the character. Yes, you did it. Awesome. Exactly. All right, you really run them through. Good job. And then they go, whoa, what? I mean, this guy's been like trying to cut me in half, and now he's cheering for me. And then they start to see that you're wearing two hats. You're playing the orcs, you're playing the villains, you're trying to give them life, but you really are on their side. And so that's, I just want to say that.
Yeah.
Okay.
That actually, from there, I can riff off one more thing. One more GM hack that I had on my list tonight was actually something I learned from our friend in common, Michelle. And I remember her, and I always see her face on this. And she helped when she GM'd, and I remember you guys out in Queens had like done a little rotation, and I'd come out there a couple of times to join you. One thing that came out clear from her style was two things: is everyone having fun? And I always believed in that too. But if you're on a certain track or you have certain players that maybe be more antagonistic, it's hard you can easily forget that as a GM. But you got to remember, everyone has to have fun. But the way it showed up for Michelle is she's like, wait, everyone gets a moment. Did everyone get their moment? And I remember a time when, like, I was playing, I was having a good time, and she was like, Phil, wait a sec. I know you can do stuff in this scene, but let Jay have his moment. And I was like, oh, all right. And like I thought about it. I was humbled a bit. And she's like, no, I enjoy your enthusiasm, but this is Jay's scene. And I'm like, wait a minute. What do you mean? Everyone gets a scene? She's like, yes, everyone gets a scene. You'll have your scene. I'm like, oh, I will? Okay, I'll shut up. But like, I have been used to characters that had to kind of like jockey for position and jockey for action. But no, if you say like, listen, if you're a good GM, you're going to plan in every character having a scene that is going to be meaningful and memorable for that character, and then everyone goes home happy. And I actually got that from Michelle. It's really interesting. Yeah.
I have a great Michelle story along those same lines. Michelle is a wonderful GM, and she has humbled me as well. I remember one time we were playing Traveler. John was running it. John with an H, not Jonathan. And he was running Traveler for us, and I didn't know Traveler. It was the first time I'd ever played it, and I was like, I don't know what to play. It's science fiction. Oh God, there's so many options.
Right.
And I came up with this idea. Let me do like the Doctor from Lost in Space, but not like the bumbling Doctor from the '60s TV show. Let me be like that really badass Doctor from the movie that came out in like the '90s or something. So I created this character who was like, he was really the villain, and I cleared this with the GM. I'm like, I'm not really going to play this character throughout the whole campaign. I'm trying to get a feel for Traveler. So let me introduce myself with a disposable character, and he turns out to be the villain. And so I played him real straight, like he's part of the crew, and then all of a sudden, at like 2/3 of the way through the session, he betrays the crew and he knifes the Royal Marine that Michelle is playing. And Michelle like blanched when I did this. And she was like, all right, she went along with it so that we could finish the story, but she did not like that. And so she took me out to dinner shortly thereafter, and we're having this lovely dinner, and she says to me, I want to talk to you about what I call the player contract around the table. And I was like, And she's like, the player contract. She's like, if the players agree ahead of time that we're going to play a cutthroat game, then cutting the throat of another player is perfectly acceptable. But if the players sit down with the expectation that we're all going to be working together, and then you breach that player contract by then cutting the throat of another player, that's not acceptable. And I was like, and now I had been like a gamer for like 10 years at this point, and I was like,
Sure.
oh.
Yeah.
I was like, wow. And she
Yeah.
totally humbled me. And I was like, you know what, Michelle, you're
Right.
absolutely right. And I never did that again. But
Right.
yeah, she has a fantastic sense. You know, she brings that womanly empathy to GMing,
Well, she
and
does.
she
Yeah, she
she
does.
taught me a lot, just as she taught you a lot, and they're very similar,
Yeah.
parallel things. Now, Peter
Mm-hmm.
taught me the something similar, which was the wouldn't it be cool if. That's how Peter described it.
Yes.
The wouldn't
Yes.
it be cool if method. And that I was coming from a place of a very mechanical game. You roll the dice, you follow the dice, yada yada yada. And Peter was like, yeah, you roll the dice, you follow the dice, but wouldn't it be cool if? And he was the one who taught me that narrative, like exalting narrative over random dice rolls, has a place in storytelling, in RPGing. And that was that, and that came from Hardy, who I think Hardy ran the group that Peter was in, and Peter kind of pulled me into Hardy's group in
Right.
Queens. And that was
Right.
an introduction to that concept that I thought was very
That's
valuable. So
awesome.
all of these
Yeah. Wouldn't
things
it be
are
cool?
kind of in the
Yeah. That's awesome.
they're kind of in the same genre.
Same vein.
Yeah, same vein. Yeah.
Yeah. Same vein. Yeah. Yeah. Now I have a couple of I look at my list and just thinking about how much we've already covered on today's session. I have a couple of what I would call smaller or more micro kind of hacks, right? But since we're on this riff though too, I'll put it this way: the riff is like what we learned from other GMs too, as well as what we brought to our own gemming. But as we're talking about gems that we learned that we took from other people's styles, I don't know, and maybe you can help me figure out who taught you and I this. I want to say it was you, but I don't think it was. And I don't know, I don't think you'll claim this. I want to say it was Jonathan, I'm not sure, but great hack I learned. Going back to the idea of the visual aid, but also the idea of zooming in and the idea of making that detail really rich for players. Somebody gave me the hack. When you're making characters, at the top of the page, always say what actor would play that character if this were a movie. Did
Yes.
you give that to me?
I did
Or
not.
was that Jonathan?
That came from the Queens group, and I'm going to say, knowing the members of the Queens group, that had to be Jonathan. That had to be Jonathan. Yeah, I can't
Plus
say
his
for
film
certain,
and
but
movie background, I would say that. Yeah.
but it's a super helpful hack.
It's a super helpful hack. And
Yeah,
in fact, what I see in my own groups is people who know my style will already, if I say, hey, let's, that I'm preparing some Ars Magic stuff. My friend Josh already knows I'm going to ask, so he already comes having researched different actors that he thinks. He already comes with his auditions done. But like new players, I'll hit flat-footed, and they're like, "Oh, I never thought about that." well, you want to know what he looks like? I say, no. I want you to find the actor that you think resonates with your character, because it will be from there that you will then start developing more of your character. And they're like, "Holy, I can't believe that's awesome."
I know,
so it's really interesting. That was like a little hack that I think I learned from that Queens group. It's got to be Jonathan.
It's got to be.
I never forgot it. I automatically put that in my that's a must-have technique. You know.
That's a must-have technique. I have a few micro hacks. So
please.
my main micro hack. I think I'm going to talk about one,
Okay.
and it's this. It's remember that the players are helping to carry the palanquin, the what do you call it, the sedan chair or whatever that thing is, what you carry, the litter, what you carry the queen on.
Yeah.
The players are helping carry that. So we keep talking about the players being flat-footed, but there are times when the GM is flat-footed, like the player does something unexpected,
100%.
and the GM is flat-footed, and or for example, a critical player cancels. I can't come tonight, and you're like, crap. What am I going to do?
Oh, no.
I've got to complete. My entire story hinged on him. Asking the players what's going on. So, for example, I'm flat-footed, right? You've done something I didn't expect.
Oh, that's good.
Okay.
Yes.
And so you're playing. Let's say you're playing Quedquist, your mage in Ars Magica, and Quedquist does something that I totally did not expect, and I don't know how to respond to it. I go, okay. So how did the people around react when he does that, and then again you're kind of like taking the crown off and you're putting it on the player's head, or if someone so if we don't know what to do tonight and you say to me, Rob, let's role play, and I'm like, all right, what do you want to play? And you're like, let's do like an Arch Magic game, and I'm like, all right, who's your character? And you're like, let me play Quidquist, a very bookish magic user. I'm like, okay, so all right, so I'll GM. I'm going to start the game. Here I go. Tell me, when the game starts in what year is it? And you say, oh, it's like
1197 AD, right?
Yeah, 1197. And I go, okay. In 1197, where do we find Quidquist? What is he doing when the session begins? And then I'm putting the onus, the burden on the player,
Right.
And the player starts to, the player has a rich idea of his or her character probably, and says, oh well, Quidquist is very bookish. So the session starts where Quidquist is in the library and yada yada yada, and he's researching this book, and the book came from a Tremere whose tradition had been infiltrated by vampires, and like now I'm getting ideas. Now ideas are going in my head,
and always sparks like that. Yes.
There you go.
And
so ask.
Right.
There's the game. The game. You ask questions in the place.
To you exactly, and that what you're talking about is a very almost a Socratic method of role playing.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But then what you're really doing is you're involving the player to a larger scale, even at their own like bewilderment that they're being asked to be like, no, we want to let you in. This is why I think you and I have always loved the troop style, because it allows it's a diffusion of that storytelling power. In fact, you don't just want to diffuse it; you need other players to supply you. And if you don't, it's like you don't have a game. You really do need those other players. That's what if you think about like at a previous session we talked about the 1960s Vegas, the 19s. We're not sure where it is. But the Vegas one, I think we really did that really well, because I didn't know much about Vegas in that time period except for a few clips of. There was a TV show, I don't remember the name of it, that was set in that time period, and there was a couple of movies. I didn't know much about it, but because of
Crime Story.
Yes,
it was called Crime Story.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Did it have Runaway? Runaway?
Yep. Runaway was the opening theme
like
song.
Dennis Farina was in that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I only knew that, and I kept on seeing that scene in those opening scenes in my mind. But because we had a particular group, if you remember, a particular group that really does the troop style and really does the Socratic questioning method well, I ended up getting a vibrant view of that world from the input of others. And I thought to myself, GM or player, I need that input. Otherwise, I can't. It's like you're co-creating a world is what you're really doing. So I really am glad that you talked about that.
Yeah, and Don would Don. I've never done this, but Don would really run an entire session from beginning to end by that Socratic method.
Oh, wow.
For me, I've only just used it to get off the ground. Get the kite in the air, and then I'm ready to take the reins. But Don would do like the whole session. And just another interesting aside that television show, Crime Story. The uncle of my very first girlfriend was an actor in that show. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's true story.
what a cool little. Right.
Yeah.
That's
awesome.
Cool. So speaking of riffing really quick off of the stultification that can sometimes happen to a GM and what to do about it. Let's just talk about that, because I've got 2 micro hacks or small level hacks for that. I don't know, again, if you taught me them or if I don't know where I got them, but here's what they are. So in order to, what I've done before is I've done it a couple of times and it's worked pretty well. It takes a little bit of prep, but it is a version of the Socratic questioning. I build what I call a side quest menu with my players. And I say, I've got some ideas for side quests, but I want to hear your ideas. Because if we build a menu, if ever together we're not quite sure how the story's going to go, let's one of us say, access the menu. And then we go to the side quest menu. And the reason why this works with younger players especially is because a lot of video games are built around menus, and they're built around side quests. And the side quests are important. They're not just side quests. They're actually they're part of the network story, right? But I say, if we build like 3 to 5 little side stories ahead of time, we can look them up and see if you guys still want to do them. But,
Wow.
and here's the big but, the side quests have to be independent of themselves. You can't, if you're going to make them attached to a character or if they're attached to something, well, then they're just part of the story. But anyone can invoke anything on the side quest menu if it's an appropriate time, if everyone decides to do it. So, for example, I did a One Ring a session, a campaign of the game system One Ring, which is it's another Tolkien session setting. It's really good. It's really well done. The second edition of the game is fantastic, by the way. And so the characters found themselves in the wilderness in Rovanion, right? They found themselves near Mirkwood, and they found themselves at Woodman Town, and we had that was kind of the scene of the action. And we had the Yule phase, which is like the Christmas time, or what you would call the winter season when nobody's traveling, right? And during the Yule phase, there actually gives you a bunch of side quests that you can just do in that season. It's not unlike in Ars Magica when you have a season in the laboratory library, and you get to pick a bunch of stuff that you're not adventuring, but you can kind of do. And like your side quest is what you're reading or what you're working on, right? It's not really a quest; it's just an activity. But in the One Ring system, you're supposed to pick a bunch of things. And I liked that enough that I said, well, let's just do that for any old season. Let's all build stuff that we want to do around this area if our adventurers are finding themselves comfortable among the people of Woodman Town. If they have a couple months or a season open and we want to do a little side thing, it could be to get to know the people better. It could be maybe we're going to hobnob with the wizard Radagast. It could be, well, we want to go orc hunting. It could be many other things, but let's come up with a bunch of side quests. And then what happened was I ended up thinking about the side quests, and then that gave me a ready, set, go thing to come up with. And I loved it because it gave me a backup. And I tell you what happened was I never felt not prepared for a session because I always knew I'd have the side quest menu if we all felt it, right? So that was kind of a cool thing.
It's so funny that you say that because I had written on my notes here, I had felt that we moved past it. I wasn't going to revisit it, but it actually ties into exactly what you're saying. Is that eventually the players give you ideas that build up enough that you reach a point in your campaign where you can actually, or I can actually, not even have to worry about writing up a Star Killer outline and just start sandboxing because the players have created what I call a to-do list, but what you're calling a side quest box, and it's the same thing. So, same thing. Yeah, if we have enough things in the to-do list, I know I'll just sandbox it tonight. I'll just go and see where the players want to go and just roll with. Yeah. Now you do have to be able to improv to some extent, and there are ways you can make your improving better. And one of those ways is remembering that the players are also carrying the palanquin. So if you're at a loss, you start asking the questions. But the other thing is just practice. Like the more you GM, the more you get better at improv. But you don't really have to improv because, as you said, if you build up that menu of side quests, you can then start thinking about the side quests on your free time and develop in your head larger stories already. And you could even make up a Star Killer outline for each of the side quests, which is a page each, which is no work at all. Yeah,
that's a great combination of techniques there, and you'll be ready for anything. And you can't feel too bad if they don't pick something. You'll get to it, or maybe it's not. You use it for. We also have gamed for so long that stuff that I never did in a previous game, I'm just saving for the next version of that game, right? I'm
glad you said that because that's another thing.
That's okay.
That's really another thing I had written down and felt like we moved past, and I wasn't going to mention it. But yes, if you write the Star Killer outline and the players go off in a different direction, and you've still got three or four scenes that you never got to, you just put them in your back pocket. You can introduce them in a different context in a different way later on. Yeah,
that's right. Now speaking of lists, there is one fun hack that I have relied on. It's a very small thing, but not so, right? Small things, who knows? A big thing may come out of this. It's to have a list of names at all times. Just a list of names. Because, Rob, I know you've been here. How many times, speaking of being flat-footed, players ask, "Oh yeah, what's his name?" Like when you introduce a non-player character, and you haven't thought of it, and you're like, "Jim," and you're like, "Jim." It's
Jim,
it's the 12th
really?
century. His name is Jim. Like, well, I don't know. Right? I mean, come on, I don't know. He's of Rusk. His name is Jim. Come on, man. So his name is Bob. So like you got to have a list of names. And what I did for Ars Magica, and I think you remember this. I don't. Well, maybe you don't. It was in my notebook, but I've had it for a while. Actually, I think our friend Chris printed one out for me. But he found somewhere that there was a list of about 20 names. He had
Mm-hmm.
20 Latin names, 20 French
Mm-hmm.
names, 20 Italian
Mm-hmm.
names, 20 English names, 20 like
Yeah.
we were playing like in England, so it was like Gaelic names. And it was so nice to have that list there because somebody could say, what's the shopkeeper's name? His name is Hewen, and it's spelled this way. And then what you would do is, what I would do is I would just make a note in my notes, in my little book. I'd say, okay, Hewen dash shopkeeper in, Morford, the village, and I would put that down. And it actually was a great hack also for when you're making characters because sometimes people are like, I don't know any Gaelic names, and nowadays we have
Yeah.
the internet, we can look them up. Back then,
Yeah.
it wasn't so easy. We had to do a little more research. But list of names is a thing, right? I mean, it's a thing.
Oh,
It gets you out of that jam.
it totally does. And I'll tell you why it's so important. So I've never been a big LARPer. I've done it a time or two, but one time I went with Peter, who I mentioned earlier in this session. I went with Peter and Hardy, who also I mentioned earlier in this session, and we went like up to Connecticut and we did this LARP, and we were playing NPCs for the players in the LARP. And so there was a very common thing that one might find among LARPists, which was people who were just like XP hunters or treasure hunters. Like if they didn't think a scene was going to lead them to treasure or to XP, they wouldn't get involved. But Peter, who is very perceptive, he has a great deal of insight. He's really a brilliant guy.
Yeah.
He when we walked away from that LARP, he identified another type of hunter, which is a little bit more subtle, which is the plot hunter. And so what would happen is if the PCs would encounter us, we were playing NPCs, and they determined that we were not the gateway to a plot that they were interested in, they would just turn away and wouldn't even role play with us and interact. They would walk away from the scene. And so I noticed that a similar phenomenon would happen in tabletop role playing if the players encountered an NPC and they'd say, "What's this PC's name?" And I'd be like, "It's Frank." And that momentary pause where they're like, "Oh, this isn't an NPC that he's pre-generated. This is somebody he's just put." So we're just going to walk away from the scene.
That's right.
So to have that list of names was helpful. Now, here's the thing, though. I take a book when I take a page from the George Lucas book when I come up with NPC names or location names. They're always meaningful. So, like for example, the name Dagobah. It actually comes from a temple, from Eastern philosophy. It's an Eastern philosophy temple. So he named this whole planet that's supposed to be a spiritual focus after an Eastern temple.
Makes sense.
And
now.
And Han Solo is like the loner. He named him Solo. Luke Skywalker. The names are evocative. They have meaning. So I thought I liked that, and in my early GMing days, I would just take random names that sounded cool. But as my storytelling, evolved, I started to give NPCs and places meaningful names. Whether it's I don't know, if it's just a river, I might call it the Fiume River, which is just the Italian word for river. But the word means river, and so it's meaningful to the concept. But there are just some times when you just can't do that, and it really does help to have a list of Gaelic names or a list of Rusk names or whatever, and you can just draw from it so that the players don't get the hint that this isn't an important person. Yeah, perfect.
Have you ever, speaking of names, have you ever had that happen in reverse where you couldn't think of a name, you came up with something, and it actually created more meaning than that was necessary? I've had this happen because as you were talking about,
had that happen.
Yeah, no, I remember one time I was playing a Middle Earth game, and the characters, this elven characters, Sylvan elf she was a Sylvan elf huntress kind of thing. We encountered like a village of simple Northmen. They were just fishers on on the banks of the Kelduin or the Anduin River, one of the Anduin River, and I just for fun I was describing a scene of like a wedding ceremony and a party that they had happened on at night. And they, the revelers were drunk, so they welcomed in these heroes and danced with them a bit. And I decided for fun that one of the simple Northmen would fall in love with my friend's elven huntress character. And she's like, what's this guy's? And she was like, of course, annoyed, but in a fun way. I'm like, what's this guy's name? And all I could think was a bunch of like consonants. So I was like, his name is Gard, Garrrrn. And this guy, though, he became a legend because what had happened was he stowed away in their boat. And because he was in love with them, with the character, and I just decided to have so much fun with it. And she ended up going from annoyed to she just loved it. She thought it was hilarious. And like, because she worked with me at the time, we see each other office, we go, Garn to each other. And it was just the dumbest story, but Garn became this like larger than life guy because I spit out this dumb name because I couldn't think of it. But like, so sometimes happy things can happen. But yeah. If you're a good GM, you're gonna like prepare yourself as much as you can for the enjoyment of yourself, but also players. And one thing I remember thinking is I gotta like this too. Like I'd lose steam over something if I wasn't entertaining myself, and if the players weren't entertaining me just as much as I was entertaining them. So these tips and tricks can really help. Now I've got one kind of final topic for you to chew on, because I think I know.
Me too.
I got an idea for you. I think you're going to riff off of one more thing, one more tip and trick. Just talking about, like, because we're getting I think just thinking about the ending. So sometimes game sessions are hard to end, and I thought of two things. The first one that I got from my friend Nate. He was the guy in college that we played Star Wars D6 and we played our Magic with. He would end every session with what he called the bad guys scene. The bad guys scene was a special kind of thing where, as the players flew away in their freighter, as the players drifted off to the sunset, or as they settled down to the mead hall, right, at the end of a successful adventuring, right, he would cut scene over to the bad guys, and he would give us one little tidbit of what the bad guys were doing, thinking, or saying, to get us to keep our interest going into the next session. So once, for example, we played this session where we were on an alien, this is Star Wars D6, on an alien planet. We encountered a bunch of Imperials. We set some charges in their hangar bay, and then we flew out of there, and we evaded a couple of TIE fighters as we went. And then, at the right moment, at the appropriate moment, we hit the button, and we saw on the vid screen the explosions down below. And we thought, great. And he goes, no, there's one more thing. And we're like, no, it's over. He's like, no, it's not over. Out from the rubble, the smoke clears, and there's a movement in the rubble. The camera pans to a hand that's sticking up out of the rubble. And then it turns into a fist that shakes its fist at you. And we're like, sweet, that was a sweet bad guy scene. We're like, oh, no way. So we knew the evil Imperial Major was still alive, but he's now bent on revenge. So it was a really cool way to end a scene. So what memory did that spark in you, my friend?
Yeah, that's called the cutscene, and I think Jonathan was the first one that introduced me to the concept of the cutscene, and so he used it, and I began using it, and then I came across a role playing a core rule book. I don't remember exactly what game it was, but it said, but be wary of using the cutscene too liberally. I mean, they're fine, but they can annoy players if you use it too much. So, but yeah, Nate was obviously using it to great effect. Yeah, that's a great final hack, and I think my last final hack is a good follow up to that. It's so your last final hack was how to end the game, and my last final hack is what to do after the session is over. So what I always do, a great hack for me, and this is particularly helpful now that I'm an old Grognard and I'm losing brain cells, is I write a 3-paragraph summary of what happened that day. No more, no less.
Yep.
And sometimes the paragraphs get long, and sometimes the paragraphs have run-on sentences. That's okay. And if that troubles you, if you're a GM, if you're like a type A personality and you don't like long paragraphs and run-on sentences, then instead of writing it right after the players leave, or even instead of writing it the day after the game session, or even 2 days after the game session, wait a few days, because all of like the nuts and bolts that like you're really excited about moments after the game session is over, you have a better perspective on it, and they don't seem quite so important, and you can sort of paint with a broader brush, and you can get a better 3 paragraphs. So, but sometimes like I like to have a really nuts and bolts long 3 paragraphs with run-on sentences summary, because the players don't care. It's not for them; it's for me. So that the next time we're sitting down to play, I can read the previous session.
Right.
And something I've been doing with my 3-paragraph summaries is, I have a YouTube channel, and it's called the Fate Master. It's called Fate Master. And what I've been doing is it's modeled after a fellow by the name of the Dungeon Minister, who is an Episcopalian priest who's running a Dungeons and Dragons Beckme Dungeons and Dragons game for his family. And he does like a 20-minute video recapping the session, which you would think is like, well, do you really want to hear somebody talk about that? But it's really interesting. He's great.
Yeah.
And it inspired me to do one of my own. I'm running a Fate game, so I do that. So I got this idea from the Dungeon Minister about maybe 10 sessions into this Fate game that I'm running for these players, and I had already had the 3-paragraph summaries for those 10 sessions, and I was still writing more and more with each subsequent session. So I just started using those 3 paragraphs as the script for my video, and I would just basically recite the 3 paragraphs on the video, add a little bit of commentary, and I came up with I've got now this video series a la the Dungeon Minister, and it's really helpful. So in this day and age where people don't have time to read, they maybe don't like to read, the players can even just watch the video, and that's fun. So that's and just the corollary to that is, and I mentioned this in an earlier session, the only game I don't do that for is our Las Vegas game. But what I do for the Las Vegas game is I have a cocktail napkin, or at least a graphic of a cocktail napkin on a marble bar, and I just handwrite on the cocktail napkin, the white space on the cocktail napkin. I handwrite a summary, and I just use that as my mnemonic for the next session, and it's super helpful.
It's meta too. I love that idea. That's so cool. Yeah, I mean, you can't run in a pair of dice, so the cocktail napkin must. That's fantastic. Well, my friend, as always, we've given ourselves a task, and we've filled out even more time than we thought we were, because we got all these great stories. So speaking of stories, how about for the next session, I think we should look at our favorite story arcs, because you and I still, when we get together, we talk about the old days, and we talk about the old story arcs and whatever happened to's, and I was going to do this with it. That always has a fascination for me. I love hearing the story arcs from your group out there. You love hearing mine. So I think we should devote the next session to that. What do you think?
That's a great idea. This is so much fun. I love doing this podcast with you, and I hope that people are finding value in it. So that's great.
Yeah, same way back. Well, until next time, this is another successful installation of the Grognards, or Grognards, however you like it, of gaming with Phil and Rob. We'll see you next time.